Welcome to your next great novel. I'm your host, Phil Williams, and today I have thriller, science fiction, and urban fantasy author John Hindmarsh on the show. He's an Amazon bestseller and author of 16 novels. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great.
Good to meet you at
Yeah,
last.
yeah, nice to meet you I guess we've met many times over email, but nice to meet you over Skype. Can you tell us a little about yourself, your life, and how you became an author?
Yes, how long have you got? Uh,
Right.
Well, start with I'm Australian, so that's why the accent's there. And I live in Southern
Which I
California.
wasn't expecting, by the way. I'd read that in your intro, but I never imagined that's the way you would sound. But anyway,
Ah,
as an aside.
right. It's a sort of biased accent because my maternal grandmother was English, and I think she corrupted my Australian accent. And I've worked internationally for years and years and years. And I haven't lived in Australia for about 40 years. So my real Australian accent has disappeared.
So you grew up in Australia. You were born
I grew
there.
up in Australia,
Okay.
left there in my late 20s, went to New Zealand, spent about 6 or 8 years in New Zealand, went back to Australia for a couple of years, went to the UK, back to Australia, back to the UK, to the US, then to Australia for a year, then the Netherlands for a couple of years, places like Istanbul for half a year, Singapore for about half a year. Lots of I was a freelance IT consultant in the latter stages of my career. And so I used to get sent off on 1 week assignments or 2 week assignments. And other times it'd be, hey, we need someone to lead this project or lead this design. And that would take 6 months or 12 months or a couple of years. And my last solid assignment took me to Bangkok for 4 years, which was quite an experience. And when we finished in Bangkok, we decided, let's go to somewhere that's about as extreme as you can get compared with Bangkok. So we moved to South Lake Tahoe in the High Sierra. So from a total tropical environment to 6 months of snow each year and so forth. And that was about 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago.
So you've seen a lot of different settings that you can use for your writing.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I've, as well as the places I've worked at, I've traveled to ancillary places. So in working in Thailand, in Bangkok, got to Nepal, got to Vietnam, got to Malaysia, got to et cetera, et cetera. So you add those regions and it builds up your exposure to cultures, to races, to people, and it helps feed your stories, I'm sure, compared with not having traveled.
Absolutely. So I don't want to date you, John, but what year was it when you started in computers?
Go away. It was the mid 80s,
Okay.
and you can date me. I'm 80 years old.
Okay. I just think it's really interesting to think about the computer industry at the very beginning stages of it, and how much you've seen all of it. You've seen the whole life cycle of it.
I have because I had a little bit of exposure prior to the mid 80s with punch card systems and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I've moved along the technical horizon, if you like, but I stopped doing that a few years ago. There's no way I could be keeping up with what's happening now.
Right. Do you remember what year it was when you learned about the internet?
It would have been late 80s.
Did you think
I,
it was going to be as big as it's become?
oh no,
No.
no way. In those days it was just a little modem and a connection you used to send a message to someone. I
Right.
mean, that was the scope.
And they put their
And
phone on the thing, right?
yep, yeah, and made that stupid noise, and,
Right.
and then it just grew. And I developed a couple of websites along the way, but there's no way I'd want to write HTML nowadays or
Right.
PHP or any other language. I really came from the business side because I was a CPA, I was an accountant, and I decided accounting was too boring. So I headed off and did some night school training, if you like, in business analysis and data analysis. And I used that plus my accounting, plus my business knowledge to move into IT. So that really was the path that I used.
Right. Well, all the business knowledge I imagine would help you being an indie publisher now.
Oh yeah, yeah, that helps as well. Yeah.
So have you always been a writer? Is it something that you did in your spare time back then, or is it something that you came into later in life?
It depends how long a story you want,
Yeah.
Phil. I claim I wrote my first pencil story when I was about 12 years old, and it was a science fiction story. It didn't get anywhere, needless to say. And also keep in mind, I grew up in Australia in the 50s and 60s, and being a writer really wasn't a career path in Australia in those days.
Hmm.
When I was in working in the UK, I wrote a science fiction story, had it typed out, and sort of put it in a file box and stored it on a shelf somewhere. And when we decided at the end of the Bangkok assignment to move to the US, and my wife's American, I was packing and found this box of typewritten stuff in the garage, and I sat down and read it instead of packing. And I thought, there's the grain of a story here. And so when we finished our move to the US, I dragged it all out and I rewrote it. And at that point, between 2012, 2014, self-publishing was starting to sort of rear its head fairly aggressively. And I thought, okay, I'm going to publish this. I'm going to publish it myself. And at that time, you contracted out the formatting, you contracted out the editing, you contracted out the cover, and so forth. Some of it you can now do in-house, but it was all contracted out then. And I released it. It got to about, I don't know, 5,000 or something on Amazon.
Wow.
But since then, I've had a couple of book bubs with that story. It's the first of my science fiction series. It's called Broken Glass. And it's reached the top 100 paid in Amazon twice now.
That's
So,
amazing. So you're
hey, that's
you're a real Amazon
bestseller,
best-selling author.
bestseller. So that was fun. That sort of triggered. Then and I described it as the first of a trilogy without even knowing what a trilogy was. So I wrote the remaining two stories, finished the series off, kind of. Left a couple of hooks there so that I could write more books in that if I felt like it. But then I decided, read so much over my reading lifetime, I could probably write most genres. There's some I wouldn't try. Erotica is one that I wouldn't try
Right.
because it just isn't my style. And so I decided to write a thriller series. And there's a genetic engineering technique or tool set or whatever you want to call it called CRISPR. And that allows very focused tailoring of the DNA spiral. And so I thought, okay, if we applied this to humans and did a little bit of super engineering, we would have some potential enhanced individuals. And so I took one individual who didn't really know how or where he'd been engineered and developed him through, sort of did a little bit of his childhood, but then put him in a fairly dangerous situation where he reacted very, very effectively against a mercenary group and, killed most of them and so on and so on. And so I wrote 4 stories in that series, and that's done very well. It's popular. I keep
That's the
getting
Mark
email.
Midway series.
That's it.
Yep.
And I keep getting emails. When are you going to write the next book,
I
Mark
noticed you have
5?
book 4. I saw that that's relatively recent, right?
Yeah, I did that a couple of years ago and promised I'll also do Mark 5. I've sort of reneged on that promise a bit because there's other stories I want to write as well. And I decided then to write an AI, sort of falling back a little bit on some of the IT history knowledge, etc. I decided to write a book on artificial intelligence or superintelligence. I wanted to lift it up a level. And I sort of drafted out a 1-page outline and decided, no, there's at least 250,000 words in that, so that's not one book. And I broke it into 4 books and just about finished at 250,000 words. So my estimate wasn't too bad.
Wow, that is a good
Um,
estimate.
from a 1-page outline, oh, that'll be about so many words. Oh, that'll be about so many more. And so it's really got 2 key protagonists, a superintelligence and a human, and they work together. And the superintelligence is ambitious. he wants to prove he's better than humans. That's his focus, that's his objective. And he sets out. So he persuades Toby, the human protagonist, to arrange a project to get him a body. So he then migrates to a body. Then he wants to be classed as a real person and manages to get legislation changed in the US so that he could be a real person to the extent that he was able to run for president.
So
And so that,
there's gotta be conflict and pushback on the people that do not want robots to be classified
oh,
as human
absolutely.
because then they have certain rights and
Yep, yep, yep. And that's a large part of the conflict because we're not just talking about a superintelligence. There's more superintelligences get developed in that are akin to this to Darwin, and there's bots all over the place. There's cleaner bots, there's packaging bots, storeman bots, childcare bots, factory bots. They're all over the place and they're growing. And of course, the business organization is key to all this, establishes free training so that people can upgrade their skill levels and so forth. But there's still conflict. There's loss of jobs. There's movement. San Francisco has suffered a major earthquake, and all of Silicon Valley is moving out of that area, and so on and so on. So I introduce brown shirts into the story. There's political issues, a lot of satire as well. I don't mention political parties. I don't get political in that sense. So I'm not saying, it's Democrats versus Republicans. It's more philosophies rather than political
right.
parties.
There's a lot of fertile ground in politics for conflict because there's
Oh,
inherently so much conflict there.
there is, and to a large extent, you can do it tongue in cheek. There's potential for a tremendous amount of satire, and I quite enjoy writing some of that sometimes because I like to use humor in my writing, and that allows me to sort of put a humorous layer into the storyline.
You don't want to be insensitive, but there is a lot of humor in seeing the fervent support that you see for different political parties. For example, if you were to go onto Facebook, onto let's say a Republican page, and you were to post, let's say you found some facts that were favorable towards the Democratic Party, it'd be interesting to see the pushback that you'd get. And then you could do the same thing on the other side and get a crazy amount of pushback. And it just really makes me wonder how much people are really thinking for themselves anymore. Not that I don't know that we ever really fully thought for ourselves anyways. I don't think that's possible because there's so many influences from the time from birth until now, from friends, family, media, education. It's definitely a fertile ground for being influenced one way or another. And I think most people aren't even aware how much they're being influenced.
I think you're absolutely right. The growth of social networking, the internet, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Tremendous good and potentially tremendous evil. So even diving into that, you could do tremendous amount of satire and, as you say, bounce back and forth between one group and the other and
Right.
create mayhem.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I find fascinating about social media is that we don't really know how social media is rewiring brains yet. It's still relatively new, but this focus on scrolling through headlines and liking what you like and disliking what you don't like, and then you are basically getting a confirmation bias of information where you're essentially running with the herd and getting to this space where anybody that says something contrary to what you already believe is automatically attacked. And then it shuts down any sort of dialogue between groups, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's too much extremism, I think, in the reactions. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's rewarded online, though. If you're on the particular group's webpage and you say something even more extreme that's in support of the group, then you're going to get likes and kudos versus
Yep.
someone that says, hey, well, maybe we should think about the other side. And then those people are going to say, shut up. Right.
Yeah, it's all this way. It's my way or no way.
That's
Yeah.
right. One of the things that is going on in your life that you haven't mentioned now is that haven't mentioned yet is that you're currently fighting a very serious blood disease called MDS, which stands for, and let me know if I say this wrong, myelodysplasia syndrome.
Yeah. Yep. That's it. That's
Yeah.
it.
Is this a type of cancer?
Yes, it's a form of leukemia,
Okay.
and there's AML, acute myeloid leukemia. Acute myeloid leukemia is a
It's worse.
pretty, yeah, it's a pretty bad place to be. Almost 3 years ago, I had a blood test and the doctor said, hey, you better go see an oncologist based on these results. And so I headed off to an oncologist and they sort of put me through all sorts of tests and so forth over a few months. And he ended up saying, hey, you've got acute myeloid leukemia. If we don't start doing something, you've only got 3 months to live. And
Wow.
that sort of started
How old were
uh,
you when that happened?
3 years ago, so
3 years ago.
77,
Okay.
because I'm 80, I think. It was December, it was approaching Christmas, when I first had that blood test. And we sort of went downhill a bit. And, my wife was very concerned. Obviously, I was concerned. And we managed to get an introduction to an oncologist at the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF. And he was a specialist in hematology and leukemia and so forth. So went and saw him. And his initial reaction was, all right, it sounds as though that may be correct. And we lived about 200 miles from San Francisco. So we drove back, we got home, walking up the stairs, the phone's ringing. Answer, it's the oncologist that we'd just seen in San Francisco. And he said, I've been thinking there's some disparity between some of the blood test results and the biopsy that was used to establish that you had acute myeloid leukemia. And he said, no, don't start treatment. You can come back and see us, we'll monitor this, but you don't need to start treatment. And so that was 2 years ago. And so I went on for probably 6 months.
Were you
Just
feeling bad at that point, or would you feel normal?
feel normal.
Okay.
I look normal, I feel normal, I sound normal. I've got no visible symptoms at all. But underneath the skin, the red cells are down, the white cells are down.
Right.
That has an impact on your energy level, that sort of thing. So I had vitamin injections for a while to help. But generally, I'm physically active, I hike, etc., etc. And I managed to continue doing that. And then about April last year, the oncologist had a very, very good illustration. He said, look, you've got a deck of cards. You know the Joker's in there somewhere. And we've been pulling cards out of that deck day by day. And the deck's getting smaller and smaller, but you still haven't hit the Joker. But the probability is getting higher that the next card will be the Joker being acute myeloid leukemia. So he said, you've got to start treatment. And so started chemo treatment last year. And that was a 4-week cycle, which is totally debilitating. You have 5 days of getting injections. I declined getting a port. I didn't want a port, into a vein where they could just pour stuff into you.
Right.
So I had injections across the abdomen. And
Oof.
yeah, you get 15 or 20 of those in a week. Your abdomen starts to
Yeah.
complain to you quite vociferously. And the chemical they dose you with kills blood cells, kills bone marrow, and so forth. On the basis it's trying to help regenerate, help the system build new good blood cells. And so your immune system drops out of sight, your energy levels fall, your brain in that week is totally fogged. Never make a decision while you're getting chemo. It just would be a bad decision. And so this 4-week cycle, 1 week of injections, a week to recover, a week thinking, oh God, I'm able to do some writing. And then you get almost 2 weeks of writing and then bang, another week of chemo. So that was pretty horrendous to go through, especially that I was being categorized as having MDS and AML. So I sort of had a foot in both camps. After a while, with another, must have been about the third bone marrow biopsy, the oncologist decided, okay, we can extend the cycle. So instead of having it every 4 weeks, because I was stable, blood counts were up a little bit, etc. And he said, let's extend the cycle. So we went to an 8-week cycle and then a 10-week cycle. So I'm now on a 10-week cycle, which means I lose about a week and a half of that 10 weeks. But the rest of the time, with some ups and downs, brain's clearer, I'm able to do more work, etc., etc. But then, of course, you get hit by things like pneumonia and pleurisy and get sent to hospital and so on and so on. So It's not a clean, okay, you've got 8 weeks out of 10 where you can live a normal life. It gets close to that, but always you've got to be aware your immune system's totally in the gutter. You've got to take precautions. At the same time, you can't wrap yourself in plastic and live in the basement. That would just be totally out of it. Now, I'm going to a writers' conference in November. There's 1,000 people going to be there. I really don't know whether I'm being stupid or what, but I'll be there.
All the
Uh,
germs.
yeah,
Right.
and I'm a part of a panel, coping with issues. So I'm trying to say to people, hey, you've still got to live a normal life. You take care of your caregiver, you know, whether that's a spouse or a family member. Make sure this, in my case, I wrap around Kathy and she goes to conferences with me and so forth. So, we're best of friends as well as being husband and wife. And we, she supports me so much that I just can't describe how much. At the same time, she's super, super cautious. So this really conflicts her when I head off
Right.
with her to a conference where you're in a room with 400 people, 500 people, and then you move to the next room and it's got 400 people or
Right.
500 people. But the alternative is to curl your toes up and say, hey, I'm not living, I'll
Yeah.
just go hide in a corner.
Right.
Uh, I can't do that. I just haven't got that mindset. I have to be positive. I have to exercise my sense of humor. While I'm an introvert, I still have to get out and about. That's what it is. Does,
Absolutely. How would you say that your illness is affecting your perspective on life and your perspective on writing? Because, not to be crass, but there's an imminent end date, right? I mean, none of us knows our own end date, but yours I would imagine, feels a lot more imminent than mine.
correct. But it depends, I think, on your mental attitude.
Right.
In my life, I've had no other serious illness. So I've lived 77, 78 years with nothing more than a stubbed toe and a bruised ego occasionally, a dose of flu perhaps, or whatever.
Right.
So I've had a pretty good health situation, and that's probably holding me in good stead at this point because I'm physically fit, or I try to be physically fit.
Right.
And there's no profile that I can look at that says, hey, you're going to live for 18 and a half months
Right.
from this point. I just don't have that information. The oncologists don't have it. They can give me all sorts of metrics, and you look at the population that formed those metrics, and they're people on their second or third bout of cancer. They've had serious illnesses. They're not physically fit, and they're probably not 80. So
Right.
if I sat and worried all the time about, oh, I could be dead tomorrow, I could be dead tomorrow, it would be so counterproductive.
Right.
What I want to do is write.
Yeah.
I want to write the next book. I want to write the book after that, and I want to write the book after that. And I want to keep doing that for as long as I can. That's my drive. That's my motivation.
Does the illness push you to try to move faster, or is it just I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to live my life the best I can, and I can't worry about what I don't know is going to happen.
When your energy level's down, your energy level is down.
Right.
In December last year, I competed with a couple of other writers to write a short novel in 2 to 3 weeks. And I did a 45,000 word novel in 2 weeks.
Wow.
It was my
Wow.
first urban fantasy story. Now, I've
That's
been sitting on the
unbelievable.
third one for over 3 months just because of circumstances. But the main thing is your immune system's down. So I'm neutropenic, is the technical description. I don't have a good immune system. And there's something called neutropenic fever. If my temperature goes over 100 degrees, 100.4 degrees, I'm in a danger area and I should seriously consider going to ER. I was in ER last Wednesday night till midnight or something when they cleared me to go home. So I live with that, I cope with that, but it isn't in the forefront. What I
Right.
want to do is finish the book I'm working on and write the next one and the next one.
It is great to have a job though, where you wake up every day and it doesn't feel like a job. It's something you actually want to do. I mean, that's the way I feel. Every day I'm doing what I want to do.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
I imagine I'd want to extend that for as long as possible.
I certainly do.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about the urban fantasy series, Zed's Parallel Universe Chronicles?
To start with, the name is a revenge on Americans because Americans call Z Z.
Okay.
My wife's American. She's always telling me to pronounce words correctly. I wouldn't mind writing fantasy. I mean, I've been a Pratchett fan and a Modesett fan, and I've read probably hundreds of books in an urban fantasy context. And I like the way Terry Pratchett could put humor into urban fantasy or into fantasy. I suppose you'd class his as urban fantasy. So it allows for a little bit more humor than, say, a thriller or a mystery or a murder story or whatever. So I thought, I want to write something where my humor can be subtle, but I can put it in there. And so I thought, right, premise, parallel universes collide. And so they no longer become parallel. They're unparalleled universes. And stuff leaks between universe and universe. So magic starts to leak through universes, and sprites get transferred, and some survive and some don't. And mages get transferred and some survive and some don't, and so on and so on. So that's the basic premise. And we start with Zed, who's a mage, and he's driving his Stanley steamer down the M1 in England and suddenly finds he's in a totally different England. And police cars are racing past at 100 miles an hour or whatever, and his top speed's about 25 to 30 miles an hour in his electric steamer. So it lets me put that element of humor in. So he gets stopped by the police, and the young police officer is totally enamored of the Stanley electric steamer and wants to pull it to pieces. So he's allowed to carry on. And he's going to London, not London, because in his universe it was London. And he rescues triplets along the way, 3 young ladies. And they're triplets born 3 years apart. So we don't know why they're born 3 years apart. And they've come from another universe, and they've been captured by some baddies and escaped, and they're rescuing someone. Zed comes along and rescues them and the person they were rescuing, and they all end up in London.
There's a bit of comedy to this book series, is there not?
It's given me an opportunity to release my humor, yes, and it's something I'm enjoying. I mean, even the triplets born 3 years apart, and you think, what the heck is that all about?
You have an excerpt from the book that you had mentioned to me before is a bit of a demonstration of the humor.
Yeah, if you would like to listen, I can read.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
I pushed open the heavy basement door, solid oak and ironbound, and warded to stop a major invasion, closely followed by Dina. Leopold would be only seconds behind us. I hit the light switches and waited a moment for the room to fill with light. As I expected, someone was, well, not so much trapped as waiting. Halfway along the length of the basement was a double pentagram, one in the floor and the second immediately above in the ceiling. They were 10 feet across and about 9 feet apart, floor to ceiling. They were constructed from brass and gold. The cost of gold was startling at the time, since it had proved to be a prudent investment. A person dressed in a business suit, relaxed, reading the Financial Times, was sitting in a steel-framed chair in the middle of the floor pentagram. Fuck, it was Lucifer, or one of them, and probably the one belonging to this universe. I signaled to Dina to keep back, at least until I determined whether he was here for friendly or inimical purposes. My shields went on automatically, full alert. I pulled up a comfortable armchair and sat. I was about 2 feet away from one of the pentagram star points. Good evening. I thought I should start the conversation. Lucid looked up, folded his newspaper, and put it aside. He smiled. He was a handsome bastard, there was no doubt. Apologies, Zed. It was an interesting article. Bitcoins. We're adopting them, although with a ton of caution. I didn't know how long you'd be and was catching up on my reading. I won't say welcome, at least not until I know what your visit is for. Oh, Zed, you wound me. We've managed to coexist without too much friction, surely. His teeth were gleaming white against his suntan. He had me there. While he was lord of the underworld and basically responsible for all the demons in this universe's related underworld, he and I hadn't had a full-on confrontation yet. I knew Dina had pulled up a chair and was sitting a foot or two from me. Leopold, I sensed, was somewhere in the background. Granted, in that case, welcome. I'll remove the pentagram restrictions if you give your word not to harm me or mine, and will leave voluntarily without objection when requested. Oh, I can manage that. I give my solemn word neither I nor any of my demons or underlings will harm you or anyone in your houses, and I will depart without delay or objection at your request. There, does that satisfy you? What were the alternatives? He could always find wriggle room if he wanted. He was the devil, after all. I said, your word is accepted. Come forth and sit with us. I signaled for Leopold to bring up another chair, and he placed it next to mine and retreated into the background. I sensed he was shielded and carried some heavy anti-demon weaponry. Lucifer nodded his thanks and sat in the additional chair. There was only a slight odour of sulphur drifting through the gap in the pentagram barrier. Lucifer sighed. A scotch would be appreciated. It's so rare I can enjoy. Dina took the hint and went to the bar at the other side of the basement and poured 4 glasses. The only scotch I had was blended, Usher's Green Stripe, a taste I enjoyed. I heard the clink of ice, sacrilege to some, but part of my drinking habit. No, I don't have a drinking habit. Damn, I was slightly flustered. Dina left a glass of water on the bar for Leopold, handed a glass to me and the second to Lucifer. She sat back in her chair with her own drink. Thank you, Dina. I must say you make a handsome couple. Dina beamed. Thank you too. I remained silent. I sipped my drink, uncertain what toast the Lord of the Underworld would appreciate. Well, I couldn't say, here's to the damnation of the devil, could I? Lucifer smiled as though he understood my dilemma and raised his glass towards me and then to Dina. He sipped. Ah, delightful. For a moment, no one spoke. Lucifer took another sip and set his glass on a small side table that appeared beside him. It was one of his, not mine. Zed, I need your assistance. Well, that was one for the books. Did I hear you correctly? His teeth gleamed. I couldn't say why I was reminded of a shark. Life was full of surprises. Oh, by the way, enjoyed the charm you placed on Huron. He's a bit of a laughing stock currently and might come looking for revenge. Just a word, you know. I nodded. Finders, they find things. Treasures, people, correct? Now I was intrigued. Yes, I drew my response out, trying to think ahead. We're expensive. He waved his hand dismissively at the mention of expense. Of course, I wouldn't expect otherwise. He took another sip. I realized Lucifer was stalling for time, gathering his thoughts. Damn. More, he was nervous. I explained we often take on cases with all kinds of personal background issues attaching to them. We are extremely careful with our clients' details. You have that reputation, otherwise I wouldn't be here. I want you to trace someone. He picked up a folder and held it for a long moment, as though weighing his next words. It gets boring sometimes, being around so many demons, some of which have the intelligence of a 2-year-old retriever and the nastiness of a starved alligator. I thought his analogy was on the soft side. He continued, as a result, about 20 years ago, I went on a crazy adventure. I adopted the guise of an educated and wealthy investor, human, of course. While I was here in London, I met a lady, a very attractive, intelligent young lady. We fell in love. We had a son. Unfortunately, his mother died to complications during the boy's birth, complications I couldn't overcome. Her soul, disappeared once she crossed the Styx. Our son survived. He was looked after, cared for by his mother's family. I covered costs. Of course, I was unable to permanently maintain the guise I had used and visited only occasionally. Lucifer took another sip. His glass was empty. He waited while Dina replenished his drink. He lifted his glass again towards Dina. Thank you, my dear. If at any time you tire of your current employment, let me know. He sipped. Where was I? Oh, yes. He handed the folder to me. I opened it while Lucifer had another sip, glanced quickly at the photograph and posted its folder and contents, including the photograph, to Dina. My son, of course he doesn't know my real identity. The last time I visited, we had a major argument. Tempers ran hot. He walked out weeks ago. I can't find him. I'd like to contract with finders. Name your price. He sipped again. Dina had examined the photograph and related details contained in the folder. Before I could even think of what to say, she said, without even a pause for breath, "Done. We'll find your son. Note, if he doesn't want to return home, we'll ensure he is in good hands, but will not force him to move." I think I'll stop there, Phil.
That was great. So I want to know if they're able to fulfill the contract and what happens if they don't. And you have to get the book for that.
Absolutely. Oh, dear. I think that's illustrated some humor, putting a bit of Bitcoin into it and so on and so on.
It makes sense that the devil would use Bitcoin. That makes a lot of sense. Be a nice binding contract for your soul.
Yep. You can't get out of this one.
That's right. It's part of the blockchain now. Besides health, what's been your biggest struggle or setback as an author?
Marketing.
Yeah.
And marketing.
Right.
I've got limited energy, to be honest, and I have to allow for that. And I'm focused primarily at writing, at finishing a book, at working on the next book. I do some promotional work. I've joined some of your promotions, as you know, and I've got a good audience of newsletter subscribers, and they enjoy my humor because I put my humor in my newsletters, and I get tremendous comments back from my newsletter readers.
A lot has happened over the past 8 years with indie publishing, where we've gone from maybe a few 100,000 authors, and now we're up to last count. And I don't think there's any place where you can find the exact number, but I think there's roughly 8 million plus books and then roughly 1 million authors on Amazon. What do you do to try to differentiate yourself from the million others?
That is so difficult to answer. The humor in my newsletters helps. My newsletter audience should be and probably are my primary readers. So when I have a new release, I would hope that I get responses for them. And so I need to maintain a good liaison with them. I would say now I've written probably 1 million words plus. So I think my writing style has matured. My writing discipline has matured. I think I can write well, and I can structure a story. I can get a message across, conflict, relationship development, etc. And I think that's all that I can do with some light marketing, because as I said, I've only got so much energy.
Right.
And key is to keep writing. And that's what I'll be doing.
Absolutely. I think that writing in different genres like you do, it makes it harder for the marketing end, but I think that you learn a lot as an author, and it really makes the writing better. However, unfortunately for people like you and I that write in different genres, it's also more difficult to market.
I think that's a valid comment. Some writers separate their writing genres by having,
Yes.
A
Pen names,
pseudonym or pen name. Or I decided not to do that because that would then mean, okay, I need a separate newsletter, I need a separate website, I need a separate. So I thought, no, I'll keep everything together, and I'll just share with my readers what I'm doing.
What would you say is the most controversial book you've ever written, and why, or a scene, or?
The Annihilation series really is controversial if you dig into it. The satire,
Right.
The political conflict, the bots versus people thing, the attacks on the superintelligences and so forth. I think that's got potential to be controversial, and
especially going forward, given all the automation that's coming our way. And
yeah, I did a little bit of research in terms of super intelligences just to make sure my flavor was correct. And I think I've reflected in a pretty good way how a super intelligence could develop. Of course, in a fictional context, in a creative writing context. So that was an enjoyable series to write.
I'm working on my first trilogy right now, and the series is entitled 2050, and then there'll be a different subtitle for each book. And the robotics piece is an issue to where a lot of the automation has created problems with employment. So now, a good chunk of the United States is on UBI, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Universal Basic Income. So a lot of people, there's just not enough jobs for people to do. So they basically collect their universal basic income check, and and they essentially don't work. And this creates, of course, a wider gap between the people that have and the people that don't, and some inherent conflict there. And then the other big conflict with the robots is this emergence of men choosing robotic partners over flesh and blood women, which I think is hilarious. But there is some evidence of this type of behavior happening.
It's a growth industry.
Absolutely. And if you look at like Japan, for example, they're having real trouble with young people kind of getting together and getting married and have children. Right now Japan sells more adult diapers than they do baby diapers.
The aging population.
Yeah, with the aging population. And one of the headlines I have in the book, because occasionally, like, one of the characters will be reading the paper and the digital paper, and they'll have different headlines. And one of the headlines is "Man on UBI starves himself to afford a sex robot." So
there's advances happening that we don't know about that are not publicized broadly, in the sense that they're developing artificial intelligence or superintelligence to run oil tankers, for example. So you can have a pilot sitting somewhere in Oslo or Copenhagen or wherever for a shipping company, and he's monitoring the progress of half a dozen tankers, and the tankers are not manned. They're all run by computers, and he's just looking at the results and saying, okay, better not go that way, you better go this way, because of storm or whatever. But the artificial intelligences are even capable of detecting that.
Yeah, I would think they would be. It's the same thing with automating the trucking. That's a big theme in my book series, where the number one job right now in the United States is a trucker. So what happens when all that's automated? And I think that's probably coming in the next 30 years.
What they're doing in Europe is experimenting with automated trucks, artificial intelligence driven, no humans involved, where they go out in convoy and they drive about 6 feet apart, because they all know what each one's doing.
Yep.
And the slipstreaming efficiency is cutting down the running costs. And of course, the fact that they're not employing humans is also cutting down the running costs.
Right.
And on the big motorways, the autobahns or whatever, then away they go. And that's in development. That's in experimentation.
So, like most authors, I'm assuming that you do, a fair amount of reading. What is it that you like to read?
Fantasy, science fiction, and thrillers.
All the stuff that you write. That makes sense.
All the stuff that I write. Yeah. I've got my new bookcases are being installed as we speak, and I've got piles of books along on the floor outside my study. And there's piles of science fiction, there's piles of thrillers, there's piles of fantasy.
So do you typically read paperbacks, or do you use digital?
These are books I had, and I don't like throwing away books. And I will read a paper book, but I have a voracious appetite for ebooks too.
I used to be strict paperback, and then I got a Kindle, and then I just realized that I didn't have to actually hold the book open, and I could do other things. If I'm riding on a bike or whatever, I can sit there and read if I'm riding a stationary bike or eating, or I don't have to hold the book open or sitting in bed or whatever. It just was a lot more comfortable. So I ended up, now I'm reading almost pretty much everything digital.
I converted early because of travel, international consulting, if you like. And I'd go somewhere for a week or a month, and I like to read when I'm not working. So in the evening, I'd have nothing to read. My wife pointed out someone sitting next to us on the aircraft. Oh, look, they've got something electronic that they're reading. And I've got a shopping bag full of paperbacks. So It was a very quick and easy conversion.
It makes a ton of sense. Not only are the books cheaper, but you can get them right now whenever you want and store them. And yeah, it's definitely nice. Yeah. Is there a particular book or author that you would recommend to the listening audience?
That's a very broad question. I mean, Terry Pratchett, he passed away a year or so ago. He's a tremendous fantasy writer. I love his stories. China Miéville, A City and the City, A City and the City. Tremendous book about two cities being located in the same place, same geospatial location, and you needed a permit to move from one city to the other. Tremendous story, tremendous concept. The typical the typical thriller writers. The list is, whether it's Baldacci or whoever, Patterson, so on and so on.
Yes.
There's just so many.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find out about you and your books?
My website is very, very simple, johnhindmarsh.com. So that's www.
So I've been saying your name wrong in my head and here on the show the whole time. So I always thought it was Hindmarsh. So it's Hindmarsh.
I was going to correct you at the beginning and thought,
we would have started off on the on the right foot there.
It's funny, Americans pronounce it Hindmarsh. Now, Brits and Australians automatically say Hindmarsh. And in my personal details on Amazon, I claim that I'm the first governor of South Australia, who was John Hindmarsh. So basically everyone in Australia knows that John Hindmarsh, pronounced that way.
Well, phonetically, it should be Hindmarsh. I don't know why I would think it was Hindmarsh, because just hindquarter,
Yeah.
it should be hind.
Absolutely. But Americans too. It's almost 90% of Americans who haven't heard me say my name will pronounce it Hindmarsh. So.
All right. Well, we got it now.
I forgive you.
After an hour-long show, we got the name right.
I forgive you.
So your website is johnhindmarsh.com, and
Yep.
I'm assuming they can find you on social media and.
Yeah, well, mainly follow me on Amazon. I mean, that would be the best, because that will always have my latest books, and you can buy one while you're there.
And there's an Amazon follow button too for those of you out there that don't know. You can just follow, and then when John has a new book out, Amazon sends you an email that's saying, "Hey, his book's out."
Yeah, it's a good service they offer.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to another episode of Your Next Great Novel. Be sure to subscribe. You can find the podcast at philwbooks.com and on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn.